Hey friend, welcome to Sleepy History World. Before we begin tonight's journey, if this channel becomes a place you enjoy returning to, a quiet escape where slow storytelling helps you relax, unwind, and gently drift off to sleep, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to subscribe. Your support helps this little community grow and allows me to keep creating peaceful history stories for you. Now get comfortable, settle in, and let's travel back in time together. Tonight we're stepping inside one of the most famous fortresses in history, the Tower of London. Most people know it as a place of executions, imprisoned kings and queens and dark royal secrets. But what if you weren't just visiting for a few hours? What if you actually lived there? Imagine waking each morning to the sound of church bells echoing across the River Thames, climbing cold stone staircases before sunrise, sharing the fortress with soldiers, servants, noble families, craftsmen, ravens, and even royal prisoners. Behind those towering walls, life wasn't filled with constant drama. It was a world of warm fireplaces on icy mornings, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the kitchens, children playing in quiet courtyards, guards patrolling ancient battlements, and thousands of ordinary moments unfolding inside one of England's most extraordinary places. So, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let your imagination carry you back through the centuries as we discover what it was really like to live inside the Tower of London. Imagine waking before dawn to the echo of heavy footsteps crossing ancient stone floors, the sound carrying through walls so thick they seemed to swallow every whisper. The air inside the Tower of London was always cool, even in the warmth of summer, and on winter mornings it felt as though the stones themselves had stolen the night's frost and held onto it. A faint smell of damp limestone mixed with smoke from fireplaces that had burned low during the night. Outside your narrow window, the River Thames rolled silently past, carrying merchants, fishermen, soldiers, and travellers whose lives were connected to the fortress in ways they rarely understood. Living inside the tower was nothing like the fairy tales of shining castles and endless banquets. It was a world of strict routines, hidden fears, surprising comforts, and constant reminders that power could change hands overnight. The tower was not simply a prison or a castle. It was an entire community enclosed by towering walls, complete with homes, workshops, kitchens, chapels, storerooms, stables, gardens, and barracks. Hundreds of people could be found living within its walls, depending on the period. Royal servants hurried through courtyards carrying messages. Guards changed shifts with disciplined precision. Craftsmen repaired weapons, carpenters strengthened gates, blacksmiths hammered glowing iron into horseshoes and locks, while cooks prepared meals for everyone from kings to ordinary soldiers. Ravens wandered confidently across the stone paths, stealing scraps whenever they found an opportunity. Cats silently hunted rats that thrived in corners where grain and food were stored. Every hour brought another reminder that this was both a home and one of England's most important military strongholds. For ordinary residents, the day began long before sunrise. Bells marked the passing of time, and duties started immediately. Fires had to be relit before breakfast could be prepared. Water had to be carried from wells or collected from nearby sources. Floors needed sweeping, chambers required cleaning, and kitchens quickly became alive with the smell of baking bread, boiling porridge, roasting meat, and freshly chopped herbs. Servants moved quietly but quickly, knowing that delays could anger powerful nobles. Even the simplest task followed an unwritten order shaped by centuries of tradition. The fortress itself never truly slept. Guards walked the walls day and night, watching both the river and the city beyond. Their eyes scanned for suspicious boats, unexpected visitors, or signs of unrest. England experienced frequent political uncertainty throughout much of the medieval and Tudor periods, and everyone understood that the Tower might become the centre of national drama without warning. One week it could host lavish royal celebrations, and the next it might receive prisoners accused of treason, rebellion, or conspiracy. Residents learned not to ask too many questions. Curiosity could be dangerous. Despite its fearsome reputation, many parts of the tower were surprisingly comfortable, especially those reserved for royalty and high-ranking nobles. Rich tapestries covered cold stone walls, reducing drafts while adding brilliant colours to otherwise grey rooms. Wooden furniture was finely carved, decorated with cushions, embroidered fabrics, and imported carpets that displayed wealth to every visitor. Candles flickered against polished metal goblets, creating warm pools of golden light during long evenings. Fireplaces burned constantly through the colder months, though heating large stone rooms remained a constant challenge. Even with roaring fires, people often wore multiple layers of wool, linen, and fur indoors. Meals reflected social rank more clearly than almost anything else. Kings and queens enjoyed roasted swan, venison, beef, pork, exotic spices imported at enormous expense, fresh fruit when available, sweet pastries, and expensive wines from across Europe. Lesser officials might receive hearty stews, salted fish, coarse bread, onions, cabbage, peas, and ale. Ordinary soldiers relied heavily on bread, cheese, pottage, and preserved meat that could last through long periods without fresh supplies. Food storage required careful planning, because shortages were always possible during sieges or harsh winters. Large kitchens worked tirelessly, producing astonishing quantities of meals every single day. Water was not always trusted for drinking, particularly in crowded urban areas, so ale was consumed regularly by adults and children alike. The alcohol content was often low, making it safer than contaminated water in many cases. Wine remained a luxury for wealthier residents, while imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and saffron demonstrated status as much as flavour. Even a simple feast communicated political power. The sounds of daily life constantly echoed through the fortress. Horses clattered across cobblestones. Armour rattled as soldiers marched between towers. Church bells summoned residents to prayer. Blacksmiths struck glowing metal with rhythmic force. Merchants unloaded barrels from riverboats below. Children belonging to officers and servants laughed in courtyards whenever their parents' duties allowed brief moments of freedom. Yet beneath these ordinary sounds lingered an unmistakable tension. Everyone knew the tower held prisoners, some famous enough to shape the future of the kingdom. Few places in Europe carried such contrasting emotions. One chamber might host elegant banquets attended by powerful nobles discussing alliances and marriages. Only a short walk away, another room confined a political prisoner, uncertain whether freedom or execution awaited. Some prisoners lived in remarkable comfort if they possessed wealth or noble birth. They could furnish their rooms, employ servants, receive visitors, read books, and even keep pets. Others endured cramped, damp cells with little natural light and minimal comforts. Life inside the tower depended almost entirely on who you were. Executions associated with the tower have become legendary, but surprisingly few occurred within its walls. Most public executions took place outside, where crowds gathered to witness justice as defined by the Crown. A select number of high-ranking individuals received private executions inside the tower, considered a privilege because it spared them from public humiliation. Residents occasionally heard rumours spreading through corridors before such events, though official confirmation often came much later. Silence became a form of survival. Religion shaped nearly every aspect of life. The chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula served as both a place of worship and eventually as the burial site for several famous prisoners, including Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard. Services brought together people from different ranks, reminding them that even within a fortress built to project royal authority, faith remained central to everyday existence. Candles illuminated stone interiors while voices rose together in prayer, briefly softening the harshness of military life. Disease remained a constant threat, despite the fortress's strength. Crowded living conditions, limited sanitation, and poor understanding of illness allowed infections to spread quickly. Waste disposal required continuous effort, but unpleasant smells were unavoidable, particularly during hot summers. Rats thrived wherever food was stored, and fleas frequently accompanied both animals and people. Physicians did what they could using the medical knowledge of their time, but recovery often depended more on luck than treatment. Children growing up inside the tower experienced a childhood unlike almost anywhere else. Massive walls became familiar landmarks rather than intimidating defences. Soldiers in armour were ordinary sights, and royal processions occasionally passed close enough to watch from windows. They played games in courtyards, learned trades from craftsmen, attended religious instruction, and listened to stories told by older servants about kings, queens, ghosts, and impossible escapes. Many accepted the extraordinary setting as perfectly normal, because it was all they had ever known. Weather dramatically influenced daily routines. Heavy rain transformed pathways into slippery hazards, while icy winters froze buckets of water and filled rooms with biting draughts despite blazing fires. Summer brought brighter days, but also unpleasant odours from crowded streets and the nearby river. Fog rolling in from the Thames could completely surround the fortress, making its towers seem to float above white clouds. At such moments, visibility dropped so dramatically that guards relied more on sound than sight. The famous ravens were already attracting attention centuries ago, although many of the traditions surrounding them developed later. Birds circled above rooftops, perched confidently on walls, and scavenged wherever food appeared. Combined with fluttering banners and distant church bells, they added to the tower's unique atmosphere. Visitors often remembered the ravens long after leaving. Night transformed the fortress once again. Gates closed securely. Torches replaced daylight. Patrols became even more alert, because darkness offered opportunities for spies, thieves, or escape attempts. Candlelight flickered through narrow windows, revealing silhouettes moving behind thick stone walls. Conversations became quieter, interrupted only by occasional footsteps or the distant barking of dogs beyond the gates. The city outside slowly settled, but the tower remained awake, always prepared for unexpected events. News travelled astonishingly fast within the walls, despite the absence of modern communication. A new prisoner, an arriving ambassador, a royal birth, or rumours of rebellion spread from kitchens to barracks with remarkable speed. Servants exchanged whispers while carrying supplies. Imagine stepping outside your chamber just as the first pale light crept over the River Thames, painting the ancient stone walls with shades of silver and blue. The fortress still rested beneath a blanket of silence, broken only by the distant call of gulls circling above the river and the slow footsteps of a watchman completing his final round before sunrise. The Tower of London looked imposing from the outside, but to the people who actually lived within its walls, it was an entire little town wrapped inside one of the strongest fortresses in medieval Europe. It was a place where families were raised, meals were cooked, children learned to walk, soldiers trained every day, servants hurried from building to building, and powerful nobles carried the weight of the kingdom on their shoulders. At the same time, it was also a place where prisoners waited uncertainly for their fate, where whispers could change the course of history, and where every stone seemed to remember the footsteps of kings and queens. Life inside the tower followed a rhythm that hardly changed for ordinary residents. Before the city outside had fully awakened, servants were already carrying buckets of water, feeding fires that had nearly burned out during the night, and preparing the kitchens for another long day. Bakers needed dough while it was still dark outside, so fresh bread would be ready by morning. Stable boys brushed horses and carried hay before the animals became restless. The smell of smoke drifted through narrow lanes between the buildings, blending with the scent of damp stone, fresh bread, roasting onions, and wet earth after the morning dew. The entire fortress slowly came alive, one task at a time. Unlike the magnificent castles often shown in modern films, the tower was crowded. Buildings stood close together inside the protective walls, connected by narrow paths that were constantly busy with people moving in every direction. Servants hurried with baskets of vegetables. Messengers rushed across courtyards carrying sealed letters. Blacksmiths wheeled carts loaded with tools and iron. Soldiers marched between guard posts, while officials inspected supplies arriving by river. There was rarely a moment when someone was not walking somewhere with an important purpose. The White Tower stood proudly at the centre, towering above everything else like a giant reminder of royal authority. Its thick walls kept the interior cool throughout the year, but they also trapped moisture, leaving many rooms with a permanent chill. Even on bright summer afternoons, stepping inside felt like entering another season. The stone absorbed sunlight very slowly and released its cold even more slowly. People often complained about aching joints, stiff fingers and cold feet, especially older servants who had spent decades working within its walls. Furniture inside most rooms was surprisingly simple, unless the chamber belonged to someone of great importance. Heavy wooden tables, sturdy stools, benches, carved chests and rope. Supported beds filled the living spaces. Mattresses were stuffed with straw, feathers or wool, depending on a person's wealth. Curtains around beds served an important purpose beyond decoration. They trapped precious warmth during cold nights, and offered a little privacy in buildings where several people often shared the same room. Thick wool blankets became treasured possessions during harsh winters when icy winds slipped through tiny cracks in stone walls. Personal hygiene looked very different from modern expectations. People certainly washed, but not every day in the way we think of bathing today. Water had to be carried by hand, heated over fires, and transported upstairs in heavy buckets. Full baths required enormous effort, so they were reserved for special occasions or wealthier residents. Instead, many people washed their faces, hands, and exposed skin regularly, while changing into fresh linen undergarments whenever possible. Clean linen was considered almost as important as bathing, because people believed it absorbed dirt and sweat from the body. Laundry itself demanded exhausting labour. Large tubs of heated water, homemade soap, scrubbing boards, and endless rinsing filled entire days for servants assigned to washing clothes. Sheets, tablecloths, towels, and garments belonging to noble households had to remain spotless, despite the constant soot from fireplaces and muddy pathways throughout the fortress. Lighting after sunset depended almost entirely on candles and oil lamps. Wealthy households could afford beeswax candles that burned with a cleaner flame and pleasant smell. Ordinary residents relied mostly on cheaper tallow candles made from animal fat. These produced thick smoke and an unpleasant odour, filling rooms with flickering shadows that danced across stone walls. Reading after dark strained the eyes, and many people simply went to bed soon after nightfall, unless their duties required otherwise. The kitchens were among the busiest places in the tower. They rarely became quiet because meals had to be prepared not only for royal guests but also for guards, servants, officers, craftsmen, and countless workers performing different duties each day. Massive fireplaces, large enough for several people to stand inside, supported enormous iron pots suspended over roaring fires. Spits carrying whole animals slowly rotated for hours, while cooks basted the meat continuously. Apprentices chopped vegetables until their hands became sore, while others baked pies filled with meat, fish, fruits, or vegetables, depending on the season. Food preservation required remarkable creativity. Salt remained one of the most valuable ingredients because it prevented meat from spoiling. Fish were smoked or dried, fruits became preserves or were carefully stored in cool places. Herbs hanging from ceiling beams slowly dried for winter use. Nothing edible was wasted if it could possibly feed someone later. Even bones became broth after the meat had been eaten. The river acted as the fortress's lifeline. Every day boats arrived carrying barrels of ale, sacks of grain, firewood, livestock, imported wine, spices, cloth, candles, and countless other necessities. Without constant deliveries from the Thames, life inside the tower would quickly become difficult. Watching cargo unloaded became an ordinary sight for anyone living there. Teams of workers rolled heavy barrels across wooden ramps, while officials carefully counted every shipment to ensure nothing disappeared before reaching the storerooms. Entertainment existed, although it often reflected social status. Noble residents enjoyed musicians, storytellers, poetry readings, dancing, board games, hunting excursions when permitted, and elaborate feasts celebrating religious festivals or political victories. Ordinary workers entertained themselves by singing while working, telling humorous stories during meals, competing in archery practice, wrestling, or simply gathering around the fire at the end of exhausting days to discuss local gossip. News from London fascinated everyone because life beyond the walls often seemed just as dramatic as life inside them. Animals played an important role throughout the fortress. Horses carried messengers and officers. Hunting dogs accompanied noble families. Cats earned their place by keeping rat populations under control. Chickens wandered freely in certain areas, providing eggs. Pigeons nested on rooftops, despite constant attempts to chase them away. Occasionally, exotic animals arrived as diplomatic gifts, astonishing everyone fortunate enough to see them. Over time, the tower even became home to a royal menagerie containing lions, leopards, bears, and elephants presented by foreign rulers. For many residents, seeing such creatures represented the most extraordinary experience of their entire lives. The weather influenced nearly every activity. Heavy rain transformed open courtyards into slippery stretches of mud, where carts became difficult to move. Strong winds rattled shutters and extinguished candles. Dense fog rolling from the Thames could hide the city completely, leaving only muffled church bells drifting through the mist. During snowstorms, the entire fortress became strangely peaceful. Its familiar grey stone softened beneath a blanket of white, while servants worked tirelessly clearing pathways before they froze solid. Medical care reflected the knowledge of the age. Herbal remedies filled shelves in small chambers where physicians and apothecaries prepared treatments using plants, honey, vinegar, spices and minerals. Leeches, bloodletting, and carefully mixed potions formed part of accepted medical practice. Broken bones were carefully set using wooden splints. Wounds from training accidents or military service demanded constant cleaning because infection remained the greatest danger. Even minor illnesses could become deadly with frightening speed. Fire represented one of the greatest fears, despite the tower being built largely from stone. Roofs, floors, staircases, furniture, doors, and many surrounding buildings were constructed from timber. Kitchens burned continuously, candles remained lit for hours, and fireplaces filled nearly every occupied room. Residents constantly watched for sparks, escaping onto wooden beams or straw bedding. Buckets of water stood ready in strategic places, and everyone understood exactly what to do if flames appeared. The tower also functioned as a centre of administration. Clerks spent long hours copying official documents by hand, using quills dipped into ink. Every letter required careful writing because mistakes wasted expensive parchment. Wax seals protected confidential messages destined for nobles across England and beyond. Entire political decisions sometimes depended on documents produced within these quiet rooms where only scratching quills disturbed the silence. Imagine standing on the tower's outer wall just before sunrise, wrapped in a heavy wool cloak as a cold breeze drifted in from the River Thames. Below you, London was only beginning to stir. Thin streams of smoke rose from hundreds of chimneys. Fishermen pushed their boats into the current, and merchants prepared their wagons for another day of trade. From this height, the city looked peaceful, almost quiet, but anyone living inside the tower knew how quickly that peace could disappear. A single royal messenger arriving at the gate at full gallop could transform an ordinary morning into one remembered for generations. Life inside the Tower of London meant living at the crossroads of everyday routine and extraordinary history, where even the smallest rumour had the power to change countless lives. The fortress was designed to impress as much as it was designed to defend. Visitors approaching the walls often felt overwhelmed by the enormous stone towers rising above the city. Massive gates reinforced with iron, deep defensive ditches, thick curtain walls, and armed guards created an unmistakable message. This was the heart of royal authority. Yet for the people who actually lived there, these intimidating structures gradually became as familiar as neighborhood streets. Children learned which staircases creaked. Servants knew exactly where the strongest drafts entered during winter, and guards memorized every crack in the walls after years of walking the same patrol routes. One of the first things a newcomer noticed was how sound behaved inside the tower. Stone walls reflected every noise. A horse entering the main gate could be heard several courtyards away. The ringing of a hammer against an anvil echoed through narrow passages for minutes. Church bells seemed louder within the enclosed fortress than they did outside. Even ordinary conversations sometimes carried farther than intended, encouraging people to lower their voices whenever discussing sensitive matters. Secrets rarely remained hidden for long inside walls where sound travelled so easily. Privacy was surprisingly rare. Even wealthy nobles shared their daily lives with countless servants, guards, clerks, cooks, and attendants. Doors remained open for much of the day, as people constantly entered with food, firewood, clothing, messages, or supplies. Personal chambers offered some quiet, but complete solitude was almost impossible, unless someone deliberately sought out one of the tower's less frequently used corners. Most residents became accustomed to living among a constant flow of people. Clothing reflected both necessity and status. Fine velvet, silk, embroidered linen, and fur lined the wardrobes of royalty and powerful nobles, while servants and soldiers relied on durable wool garments capable of surviving years of hard work. Cloaks were essential because the weather inside large stone buildings often felt colder than outside. Leather boots wore down quickly on rough cobblestones, requiring frequent repair. Tailors living within or near the tower remained busy throughout the year, mending torn sleeves, replacing worn collars, and altering garments as fashion slowly evolved. The changing seasons dramatically altered daily life. Spring filled the fortress with renewed activity as gardens were planted, and fresh vegetables finally returned after the long winter. Herbs such as rosemary, thyme, sage, mint, and parsley were carefully cultivated because they flavored food and served medicinal purposes. Summer brought longer working hours, brighter evenings, and an increase in visitors arriving by river. Autumn became the season of preparation, when firewood was stacked, grain was stored, meat was salted, and every household planned carefully for the difficult months ahead. Winter tested everyone. Ice-coated staircases, freezing winds swept through open courtyards, and fireplaces burned almost constantly, while servants carried endless loads of firewood from storage sheds. The tower smelled different depending on where you walked. Near the kitchens came the comforting aroma of bread, roasted meat, herbs, onions, and wood smoke. Close to the stables, the scent of horses, hay, and leather filled the air. Workshops carried the smell of hot iron, sawdust, fresh cut timber, and animal glue used by craftsmen. Around the walls overlooking the river, the breeze often carried the salty smell of water mixed with mud exposed during low tide. None of these scents remained isolated for long. Winds constantly blended them together, creating an atmosphere unlike anywhere else in London. Daily communication relied entirely on human effort. Every important message travelled on horseback, by boat or on foot. Messengers arriving from distant castles often looked exhausted after days of difficult travel. Their horses sweated heavily, their boots were covered in mud, and their cloaks carried the dust of countless miles. Yet everyone understood the importance of these arrivals. A sealed letter could announce a royal birth, declare war, summon armies, pardon a prisoner, or order an execution. Entire futures sometimes rested inside a single folded piece of parchment. The people responsible for maintaining the tower rarely received recognition despite performing essential work. Masons constantly inspected walls weakened by weather. Carpenters repaired gates, bridges, roofs, and staircases. Roofers replaced damaged tiles after storms. Plumbers maintained lead pipes carrying water where possible. Glaziers repaired expensive glass windows, which remained uncommon luxuries in many buildings. Without these skilled workers, the mighty fortress would have slowly crumbled, despite its seemingly indestructible appearance. Markets outside the tower supplied much of what residents needed. Merchants arrived regularly selling fish, vegetables, spices, cloth, candles, pottery, baskets, ropes, tools, and livestock. Officials carefully negotiated prices while ensuring enough supplies remained available for everyone living inside the walls. Fresh food always received priority because preserving every meal was impossible. Seasonal produce meant diets changed naturally throughout the year. Apples, pears, berries, cabbages, beans, onions, leeks, and root vegetables appeared when harvests allowed, making each season feel distinct through its flavours. For women living inside the tower, responsibilities varied enormously depending on their social position. Noblewomen managed large households, supervised servants, arranged marriages, educated children, oversaw clothing production, and maintained correspondence with influential families across England. Their days were rarely idle despite popular myths, suggesting aristocratic women spent all their time relaxing. Servant women performed physically demanding work from dawn until night, carrying water, washing clothes, preparing meals, cleaning chambers, spinning wool, mending garments, and caring for children. Both noblewomen and servants understood that the smooth operation of the household depended heavily upon their efforts. Education inside the tower reflected privilege. Young noble children often learned Latin, French, reading, writing, arithmetic, music, religion, and courtly manners from private tutors. Boys destined for military or political careers studied strategy, history, and administration alongside physical training. Girls received education focused on household management, literacy, music, embroidery, and diplomacy through conversation. Meanwhile, the children of ordinary workers typically learned practical trades by watching parents and masters perform daily tasks, gradually becoming skilled through experience rather than formal schooling. Weather could completely transform the appearance of the fortress. After heavy rain, every stone glistened under grey skies, while puddles reflected towering walls like mirrors. During foggy mornings, only the upper portions of the White Tower remained visible, appearing almost to float above the clouds. Bright summer sunlight illuminated colourful banners fluttering proudly above the battlements. Snow-covered rooftops with remarkable beauty disguising the harshness of military architecture beneath peaceful white blankets that lasted only until countless footsteps disturbed them. Festive occasions temporarily erased many of the hardships of daily life. Royal weddings, victories in battle, coronation celebrations, or major religious holidays filled halls with magnificent decorations. Musicians played lively melodies while tables overflowed with roasted meats, sweet pastries, fruit preserves, cheeses, fresh bread, and imported wines. Bright tapestries covered bare walls, candles multiplied until entire chambers glowed warmly, and laughter echoed through rooms that on ordinary days felt formal and restrained. Even servants often received better meals and extra ale during important celebrations, making these occasions eagerly anticipated throughout the year. Yet joy never completely erased uncertainty. England's political landscape shifted frequently, and the Tower stood at the centre of nearly every major crisis. Residents became experts at reading subtle signs. An unusually large number of guards at the gate, hurried meetings among officials, unexpected deliveries of weapons or noble visitors, arriving without prior notice, often hinted that something significant was unfolding. People learned not to speculate openly, but everyone quietly observed these details, trying to understand events before official announcements arrived. The Tower also attracted travellers from distant lands. Ambassadors, foreign merchants, church officials, knights, scholars, and visiting nobles all passed through its gates at different times. Their clothing, languages, customs, and gifts introduced residents to cultures they might never otherwise encounter. Imagine that it is the middle of the night, long before the invention of electric lights, and you suddenly awaken to the distant sound of iron keys rattling somewhere deep inside the fortress. For a brief moment, everything is silent again. Then comes the slow creak of a wooden door, followed by the measured footsteps of guards making their rounds beneath the glow of flickering torches. The Tower of London was never completely quiet. Even while most of its residents slept, someone was always awake. A sentry watched from the battlements. A stable hand calmed a restless horse. A cook prepared bread for the coming morning, or a prisoner stared into the darkness unable to sleep. The fortress had a rhythm that continued every hour of every day, making it feel less like a monument and more like a living organism that never truly rested. One of the greatest luxuries inside the tower was warmth. Modern homes can be heated with the turn of a switch, but medieval and Tudor residents had to fight constantly against the cold. Fireplaces were the centre of nearly every room, yet they could only warm the space immediately around them. Heat escaped quickly through tall ceilings, stone walls. People often gathered close to the fire after sunset, not only because it was warmer, but because it was the brightest place in the room. Family conversations, storytelling, sewing, reading prayers, and even business discussions naturally happened around the fireplace, where the crackling flames became both a source of comfort and companionship. The windows themselves were far smaller than many people imagine. Glass remained expensive for much of the tower's history, and many openings were narrow by design to strengthen the fortress against attack. Sunlight entered only in limited amounts, giving many rooms a permanently dim atmosphere. On cloudy days, even at midday, candles might be needed for detailed work such as embroidery, reading, or writing official documents. Residents quickly adapted to living in softer light, but visitors from grander palaces often remarked upon how gloomy some chambers felt despite their impressive size. Daily clothing rarely remained clean for long. Stone staircases collected dust carried in by countless boots. Fireplaces produced soot that settled on fabric, and muddy courtyards became unavoidable after rain. Servants spent endless hours brushing cloaks, beating rugs, polishing shoes, and cleaning garments as thoroughly as the technology of the day allowed. Noble families changed clothing more frequently than ordinary workers, but everyone accepted that life inside an active fortress involved a certain amount of dirt. One surprising feature of the tower was the sheer number of stairs. Nearly every building contained winding stone staircases that climbed steeply upward inside narrow towers, carrying heavy buckets of water, baskets of food, sacks of flour, bundles of firewood, or barrels of ale. Up these steps demanded tremendous physical strength. Servants developed remarkable endurance simply through performing ordinary household duties day after day. A single forgotten item could require climbing several flights of uneven stone steps all over again. Meals were social occasions that reinforced hierarchy. At grand banquets, every person's seat reflected their rank. The most honoured guests sat closest to the highest-ranking individual, while servants moved quietly around the room, carrying platters of food in carefully rehearsed order. Etiquette mattered enormously, knowing when to speak, how to address others, and even how to accept food demonstrated education and status. Yet, behind the formal atmosphere, kitchens worked under intense pressure. A delayed dish or poorly cooked roast could embarrass an entire household. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every meal. Wealthy families enjoyed fine white bread, made from carefully sifted flour, while ordinary workers usually ate darker loaves containing barley, rye, or oats. Bread accompanied soups, stews, roasted meats, fish, cheese, vegetables, and almost every other dish. Large stale loaves sometimes served as edible plates called trenchers, soaking up juices before eventually being eaten or given to the poor. Nothing was wasted unless absolutely necessary. The tower also had its own distinctive smells during different times of day. Morning brought fresh bread and wood smoke. Midday carried the scent of cooking meat, horses, leather, and river air. Evening introduced candle wax, damp stone cooling after the day's warmth, and the lingering aroma of large communal meals. During rainy weather, the entire fortress smelled of wet limestone and earth. These scents became so familiar that long-time residents barely noticed them anymore, while newcomers found them unforgettable. Daily life was shaped by countless small rituals. Every gate had opening and closing procedures. Every meal followed established customs. Religious observances marked the passing weeks and seasons. Guards performed inspections at regular intervals. Bells announced important moments throughout the day. These routines created a sense of order within a place where unexpected political events could disrupt everything without warning. Familiar habits provided stability in an uncertain world. Visitors frequently underestimated how much paperwork existed even centuries ago. The tower housed officials responsible for recording deliveries, military supplies, royal finances, legal proceedings, and government correspondence. Clerks spent entire days writing carefully by hand, copying records onto expensive parchment that had to remain legible for years. Ink stains covered their fingers, while sharpened quills wore down rapidly through constant use. Every document represented hours of careful work, because mistakes often required beginning again from the start. Living among soldiers meant becoming accustomed to military discipline. Trumpets occasionally signalled important arrivals. Practice drills echoed across courtyards. Armour clinked as men marched in formation. Weapons required constant maintenance, because rust could quickly damage expensive swords, helmets, and breastplates. Even during peaceful years, readiness remained essential. The tower existed first and foremost as a fortress, and everyone living there understood that its defensive purpose could suddenly become very real. The changing population gave the tower an unusual atmosphere. Some residents lived there for decades, while others stayed only days or weeks. Royal visitors arrived with enormous entourages before departing for other palaces. Ambassadors came bearing gifts and diplomatic messages. Prisoners entered under heavy guard. Craftsmen completed specific projects before returning to the city. Servants found employment or sought opportunities elsewhere. This constant movement meant that familiar faces regularly disappeared, while new ones took their place. The tower also reflected the changing fashions of England across centuries. Clothing styles evolved, hairstyles changed, furniture became more elaborate, and dining customs slowly shifted. Residents who spent their entire lives there witnessed remarkable transformations without ever leaving the fortress. What had seemed modern in their youth gradually appeared old-fashioned, as younger generations introduced new tastes influenced by Europe and the royal court. Rainy days brought their own unique challenges. Laundry dried slowly, pathways became slippery, and supplies arriving by boat often arrived soaked despite every precaution. Yet rain also washed soot from the walls and filled wells with fresh water. Children often watched storms from covered walkways, fascinated by lightning flashing beyond the city skyline while thunder echoed dramatically around the ancient towers. Animals behaved as predictably as the people. Ravens seemed to know exactly when kitchens discarded scraps. Dogs greeted familiar servants each morning. Horses recognized their regular caretakers. Cats patiently waited near storerooms where mice inevitably appeared. These animals formed part of everyday life, providing companionship as well as practical assistance. Their presence softened the otherwise imposing military environment. Conversations inside the tower ranged from the ordinary to the extraordinary. One servant might complain about sore feet after climbing stairs all day, while another quietly discussed rumors of a nobleman's arrest. Cooks exchanged recipes using newly imported spices. Soldiers debated military campaigns fought hundreds of miles away. Clerks discussed taxes, laws, and royal decrees. Children invented games using pebbles and sticks, while completely unaware that nearby adults were talking about events that would one day fill history books. Perhaps the greatest challenge of living inside the tower was accepting uncertainty. A servant who faithfully performed duties for years might suddenly find themselves serving a completely different household after a political change. A guard assigned to protect a royal guest one week might escort a prisoner the next. A noble family enjoying luxurious apartments could unexpectedly lose royal favour and depart under circumstances no one had anticipated. Stability often depended less upon personal choices than upon decisions made at the highest levels of government. Despite this uncertainty, Genuine friendships developed across years of shared experiences. Servants who worked together since childhood understood one another, almost like family. Soldiers trusted companions who had stood beside them through countless night watches. Craftsmen passed skills from one generation to the next, preserving traditions that outlived individual lifetimes. Weddings, baptisms, and religious festivals strengthened these relationships, reminding residents that community could flourish even inside a fortress famous for conflict. Imagine opening the heavy oak shutters on a clear autumn morning and watching a blanket of mist slowly lift from the River Thames. For a few peaceful moments, the Tower of London seemed separated from the rest of England. The sounds of the busy city beyond the walls were softened by the fog, leaving only the cries of ravens, the splash of oars cutting through the river, and the distant ringing of church bells. But that quiet never lasted for long. Before the sun had fully climbed into the sky, servants were already crossing the courtyards with baskets of bread. Soldiers were reporting for duty. Horses were being led from the stables, and clerks were unlocking rooms filled with government records. Every sunrise marked the beginning of another carefully organized day inside one of the busiest fortresses in the kingdom. Although the tower is remembered today for dramatic stories of imprisoned princes and famous executions, those moments represented only a tiny fraction of its long history. Most days were surprisingly ordinary. The majority of people living there spent their time worrying about everyday concerns rather than great political events. A cook wondered whether enough flour remained for tomorrow's bread. A tailor hurried to finish repairing a nobleman's cloak before an important ceremony. A mason inspected weathered stone after several days of heavy rain. Stable workers checked the health of valuable horses. Mothers comforted crying children while fathers returned from long hours standing guard on the walls. These simple routines filled far more hours than the extraordinary moments that later captured the attention of historians. The tower operated almost like a small self-contained town. Nearly every essential skill could be found somewhere inside its walls. Carpenters shaped timber into doors, furniture, and bridges. Blacksmiths repaired weapons, horseshoes, hinges, and locks. Bakers worked beside blazing ovens from before dawn until late afternoon. Brewers produced ale in large quantities, while butchers prepared meat delivered from surrounding farms. Rope makers twisted thick cords needed for cranes, ships, and lifting heavy supplies. Every occupation depended on another, creating an intricate network of workers whose efforts kept the fortress functioning every single day. Fresh water demanded constant attention. Wells supplied much of what residents needed, but water still had to be drawn by hand using buckets and ropes. Carrying it across uneven courtyards and up steep staircases became one of the most physically demanding daily chores. Hundreds of buckets were needed for cooking, washing, brewing, cleaning, caring for animals, and extinguishing fires. During dry periods, careful management of water became especially important, reminding everyone that even the strongest fortress depended upon basic natural resources. Time itself was experienced differently. Without clocks in every room, people relied upon church bells, sunlight, candles, and familiar routines to measure the day. Dawn signaled the beginning of work. Midday meals often arrived when the sun stood highest. Evening prayers announced the approach of night. Seasons changed gradually rather than according to calendars hanging on walls. Residents became remarkably skilled at judging the hour, simply by observing the light entering their windows or listening for the next bell. One of the greatest challenges of life inside the tower was carrying everything by hand. There were no elevators or mechanical lifts for ordinary household tasks. Firewood, barrels of ale, sacks of grain, furniture, armor, and even building materials had to be transported using human strength or horses whenever possible. Servants climbed countless staircases every day, balancing heavy loads with practiced ease. Visitors often underestimated how exhausting daily life could be simply because of the fortress's size and vertical layout. The kitchens revealed the remarkable organization required to feed hundreds of people. Every ingredient had to arrive at the correct time. Every fire needed constant tending, and every meal required careful planning. Roasting meat demanded hours of attention to prevent burning. Bread had to be baked in precise quantities because stale loaves quickly became less desirable. Fish arrived according to tides and seasons, while vegetables depended entirely upon harvests. Cooks became experts at adapting menus when deliveries failed or supplies unexpectedly ran short. Life also revolved around maintenance. Stone walls might appear eternal, but they required continuous care. Rain gradually weakened mortar between blocks. Wooden roofs needed replacement after years of exposure to wind and snow. Iron gates rusted without regular treatment. Window shutters loosened over time. Even cobblestone paths developed uneven surfaces after centuries of footsteps. Residents constantly repaired, replaced, polished, reinforced, and improved every part of the fortress. Without this endless work, the tower could never have remained standing for so many generations. Children growing up inside the walls enjoyed freedoms unavailable in many crowded parts of medieval London. Within the secure enclosure, they played games in open courtyards under the watchful eyes of family members and servants. They chased one another around towers, practiced throwing small wooden balls, skipped ropes, played simple board games, and listened eagerly to stories told by elderly guards who claimed to remember remarkable events from decades earlier. Their playground happened to be one of the most famous fortresses in Europe, yet to them it simply felt like home. Learning practical skills began early. Boys often accompanied craftsmen, gradually mastering woodworking, metalworking, or military duties through observation and repetition. Girls learned cooking, sewing, spinning, embroidery, household management, and caring for younger children. Education extended far beyond books. Nearly every daily task became an opportunity for older generations to teach younger ones knowledge, accumulated over decades of experience. Markets beyond the tower walls remained closely connected to life inside. Although the fortress stored significant supplies, fresh produce still arrived regularly from surrounding farms and villages. Farmers entered the city with carts loaded with apples, onions, carrots, beans, herbs, eggs, milk, butter, and poultry. Fishermen supplied fresh catches from the Thames and nearby coastal waters. Merchants introduced imported luxuries, including citrus fruits, almonds, raisins, pepper, cinnamon, sugar, and fine cloth. Wealthier households eagerly purchased these expensive goods to demonstrate both status and refined taste. For many residents, one of the most anticipated occasions each year was Christmas. Preparations began weeks in advance. Extra firewood was collected. Large quantities of food were preserved. Decorations made from evergreen branches brightened otherwise grey interiors. Musicians rehearsed performances while cooks planned elaborate feasts. Even those with modest means hoped for special treats unavailable during ordinary weeks. The celebration offered a rare opportunity for nearly everyone, regardless of status, to experience a temporary escape from routine. Medical emergencies reminded people how fragile life remained. Falls from staircases, burns from fireplaces, accidents involving horses, infected cuts, and seasonal illnesses affected residents regularly. Herbal medicines, poultices, and traditional remedies formed the foundation of treatment. Recovery often depended upon rest, clean surroundings, and good fortune rather than medical certainty. Families understood that even healthy young people could suddenly become seriously ill. Weather influenced emotions as much as activities. Bright spring mornings encouraged cheerful conversation, while long stretches of cold rain left many residents tired and irritable. Storms rattled shutters throughout the night, making sleep difficult. Dense winter fog reduced visibility so dramatically that towers seemed to vanish only a short distance away. Yet sunny evenings transformed the fortress into an unexpectedly beautiful place, with golden light reflecting from limestone walls and banners fluttering gently above the battlements. Living beside the Thames meant witnessing a constant procession of boats. Small fishing vessels shared the river with merchant ships carrying wool, wine, timber, spices, and cloth from across Europe. Royal barges decorated with colourful banners occasionally arrived carrying important guests in magnificent style. Watching these vessels became a favourite pastime whenever duties allowed a few moments of rest. The river connected the tower to the wider world, bringing not only supplies, but also ideas, fashions, news, and visitors from distant lands. As darkness settled each evening, the atmosphere shifted once again. The bustle of daytime gradually faded into quieter routines. Servants cleared tables after supper. Fires were carefully arranged to burn safely through the night. Guards inspected gates one final time before locking them securely. Families gathered for evening prayers. Candles illuminated rooms with gentle golden light, casting long shadows across stone walls that had witnessed centuries of triumph and tragedy. Outside, the city slowly grew quieter, but inside the tower, the night watch began its work, ensuring that someone remained alert until dawn returned. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of living inside the tower was how quickly extraordinary surroundings became ordinary. After years spent there, towering walls no longer inspired amazement. Royal ceremonies became familiar events rather than unforgettable spectacles. The arrival of foreign ambassadors, military commanders, bishops, or noble families gradually lost its novelty. Imagine waking on a freezing January morning when the sun would not appear for hours. The only light inside your chamber came from glowing embers that had survived the night beneath a blanket of ash. Pulling yourself from bed meant stepping onto an icy stone floor that stole the warmth from your feet almost instantly. Your breath formed tiny clouds in the air as you hurried to stir the fire back to life. Outside the narrow window, frost covered the rooftops of the Tower of London, and the River Thames moved slowly beneath a pale grey sky. Before breakfast had even begun, the fortress was already awake. Somewhere, a blacksmith's hammer rang through the cold air. A rooster crowed from a nearby yard, and guards exchanged greetings while beginning another long day watching over one of the most important places in England. Winter inside the tower demanded preparation unlike any other season. Firewood became almost as valuable as food. Huge stacks of logs were carefully stored throughout the fortress months in advance, because running out during a harsh winter could make life miserable. Servants spent hours carrying heavy bundles to kitchens, great halls, and private chambers. Even with roaring fires, many rooms never became truly warm. Stone absorbed the cold so completely that walls remained icy to the touch for weeks. People often slept wearing woolen caps, thick stockings, and extra layers beneath their blankets, simply to stay comfortable until morning. Life slowed during the darkest months, but it never stopped. Government business continued regardless of weather. Royal messengers still arrived through snow and rain. Deliveries of grain, meat, wine, and firewood continued whenever roads allowed. Guards remained on duty despite freezing winds blowing across the battlements. Their cloaks protected them only so much, and standing motionless for hours required remarkable endurance. Many soldiers stamped their feet or rubbed their hands together simply to keep feeling in their fingers while remaining alert. Inside the kitchens, however, winter created an entirely different atmosphere. Massive fireplaces burned almost continuously, filling the rooms with welcome warmth. Large pots of thick stew simmered for hours, filling the air with the rich aroma of onions, herbs, root vegetables, and slow cooked meat. Fresh bread emerged from ovens throughout the day, its smell drifting into nearby courtyards and making hungry workers quicken their pace toward mealtime. The kitchens became gathering places where servants exchanged stories while preparing food, enjoying one of the few truly warm spaces in the entire fortress. As spring gradually arrived, life changed almost overnight. The cold grey walls seemed brighter beneath longer days. Birds returned to nest among rooftops and towers. Tiny green shoots appeared in gardens that had looked lifeless only weeks earlier. Residents welcomed fresh vegetables after months of preserved food. The arrival of spring lifted spirits throughout the tower. Windows opened more frequently, allowing fresh air to replace the smoky atmosphere trapped indoors during winter. Laundry dried outside once again, and children spent more time playing in the courtyards beneath the watchful eyes of their parents. Summer brought its own challenges. Although the fortress no longer battled freezing temperatures, crowded living conditions created uncomfortable heat inside many buildings. Kitchens became almost unbearable during the hottest afternoons, as cooks worked beside enormous fires. Flies gathered around food whenever servants were not careful. Meat spoiled more quickly, making proper storage essential. The smell of the nearby river sometimes became unpleasant during long dry spells, particularly when tides exposed muddy banks beneath the city. Even so, summer remained the favourite season for many residents, because daylight lasted well into the evening, giving everyone more time to complete their work before darkness arrived. The gardens inside and around the tower played a more important role than many people realise. They were not simply decorative spaces for noble families to admire. Herbs grown there flavoured meals, treated illnesses, and supplied ingredients for medicines. Mint freshened stale rooms, lavender-scented clothing stored in wooden chests. Sage, rosemary, thyme, and parsley appeared regularly in kitchens. Some plants eased stomach pain, while others helped clean wounds or soothe headaches. Gardeners carefully tended these valuable plants throughout the growing season, understanding that their harvest could improve life for hundreds of people. The tower also possessed a surprising variety of colours that modern visitors sometimes forget. Today we often imagine medieval buildings as endless grey stone. But centuries ago, the fortress contained brightly painted doors, colourful banners fluttering from towers, richly dyed clothing, polished shields, reflecting sunlight, painted furniture, embroidered tapestries, and stained glass windows glowing with reds, blues, and golds. During royal celebrations, additional decorations transformed courtyards into vibrant displays of wealth and power. The medieval world was far more colourful than many people expect. Every resident eventually learned the importance of the fortress gates. They controlled the rhythm of daily life. At dawn, they opened to allow deliveries, workers, visitors, and officials to enter. Throughout the day, guards carefully inspected everyone arriving or departing. As evening approached, people hurried to finish business before the gates closed for the night. Missing the closing time could mean waiting outside until morning, regardless of weather. Once locked, the tower became a world almost entirely separate from the city surrounding it. The yeoman warders and other guards carried tremendous responsibility. Beyond protecting the fortress, they escorted important visitors, supervised prisoners, inspected security, and maintained order throughout the complex. Discipline remained strict, because even small mistakes could have serious consequences. Guards trained constantly to remain prepared for emergencies, yet much of their work involved patience rather than action. Long hours passed quietly, interrupted only by routine inspections, conversations with fellow soldiers, and occasional visitors seeking entry. The tower's chapels offered moments of peace unlike anywhere else within the fortress. Their stone interiors felt calm, even when political tensions filled the surrounding buildings. Soft candlelight reflected from polished surfaces while prayers echoed gently beneath ancient ceilings. For many residents, attending religious services provided comfort amid uncertain times. Weddings, baptisms, funerals, and daily worship all took place within these sacred spaces, marking the most important moments of countless ordinary lives. Letters connected the tower with the rest of the kingdom. Every message required careful preparation. Ink had to be mixed correctly. Quills needed frequent sharpening. Wax seals protected important correspondence from tampering. Once completed, letters travelled by trusted messengers across difficult roads, regardless of weather. Waiting for replies could take days or even weeks, teaching patience that modern communication has almost erased. Every arriving messenger carried not only news, but also hope, relief, or sometimes devastating disappointment. The fortress changed dramatically after sunset. Torches replaced daylight, creating islands of flickering orange light surrounded by deep shadows. Familiar buildings looked entirely different beneath the glow of firelight. Footsteps echoed more loudly across quiet courtyards. Conversations became softer as people prepared for sleep. Guards carried lanterns while making their rounds, their moving lights briefly illuminating towers before disappearing once again into darkness. Looking upward revealed countless stars far brighter than those visible in modern cities, untouched by electric light, Storms could make the tower feel almost alive. Strong winds howled around corners, rattled shutters, and whistled through narrow openings high above the ground. Rain struck rooftops with remarkable force before rushing through gutters into the courtyards below. Thunder rolled across the sky, echoing between stone towers until it seemed the fortress itself was speaking. During especially violent storms, children often gathered near fireplaces while older family members told stories to distract them from the frightening sounds outside. Residents also developed a remarkable awareness of smells indicating danger. Smoke carried unexpectedly through a corridor might signal a fire. The scent of spoiled food warned kitchen workers to discard supplies before illness spread. Dampness inside storage rooms suggested leaking roofs requiring immediate repair. Experience taught people to notice these subtle changes long before problems became obvious. Their senses formed an important part of daily survival. Perhaps the most overlooked aspect of living inside the tower was how ordinary birthdays, friendships, marriages, and family traditions continued despite the fortress's famous reputation. Children celebrated growing older with small treats whenever families could afford them. Couples walked together during quiet evenings after completing their duties. Friends shared jokes while repairing armor or preparing meals. Elderly residents passed stories to younger generations, describing how the tower had changed during their lifetimes. These deeply human moments rarely appear in history books, yet they formed the true fabric of everyday life. If you had spent decades living inside the Tower of London, you would likely remember the place not for its famous prisoners or royal ceremonies, but for the countless ordinary experiences repeated year after year. Imagine that it is late afternoon, and sunlight is pouring across the inner ward of the Tower of London. The pale limestone walls glow with a warm golden colour that lasts only a short while before evening shadows begin to climb the towers. The busiest part of the day is slowly coming to an end. Craftsmen are putting away their tools. Horses are being led back into the stables. Cooks are preparing the evening meal, and guards are changing shifts with practiced precision. From the battlements, you can see thousands of rooftops stretching across London, smoke curling into the sky from countless chimneys. The city beyond the walls seems endless, noisy, and unpredictable. Yet inside the tower, life continues according to routines that have hardly changed for generations. One of the first lessons every new resident learnt was that patience was part of daily life. Almost everything took longer than it does today. A simple meal required hours of preparation, because every ingredient had to be cleaned, chopped, cooked over open flames, and carried by hand. Clothing could not simply be replaced when worn out. It had to be repaired again and again, until every patch itself needed another patch. If a window shutter broke during a storm, a carpenter might spend an entire day crafting a replacement. Nothing was rushed because almost nothing could be rushed. The fortress constantly reminded people that nature still controlled much of their lives. A week of heavy rain could delay food deliveries. Strong winds could prevent boats from reaching the tower's wharf. A poor harvest hundreds of miles away might eventually mean smaller portions at dinner. Even the wealthiest noble could not command the weather. Living inside one of England's strongest fortresses did not free anyone from depending upon the changing seasons. Morning routines remained almost identical from one household to another. Fires were revived before anything else, because warmth and cooking both depended on them. Ashes from the previous day had to be cleared away before fresh wood could be added. Water was fetched, bread sliced, tables prepared, and animals fed. Only after these essential tasks were completed could people begin their regular duties. The rhythm became so familiar that many residents could almost predict the sounds they would hear at every hour of the day. The tower was also a place filled with constant movement. Looking across the courtyards at almost any moment, you would see people carrying something. One servant balanced baskets overflowing with vegetables. Another struggled beneath a bundle of firewood. A messenger hurried with sealed documents tucked safely beneath his cloak. Soldiers transported bundles of arrows to the armory. Laundry workers carried freshly washed linen fluttering gently in the breeze. Rarely did anyone walk empty-handed. Furniture inside the tower reflected practicality rather than luxury for most residents. Chairs were surprisingly uncommon outside the chambers of important people. Benches and stools served everyday needs because they were easier to build and move. Chests functioned both as storage and seating. Tables were often assembled only when needed before being taken apart again to create more space. Every object usually served several purposes because rooms were expected to remain flexible. Although candles illuminated the evenings, they were never wasted. Light itself represented an expense. Wealthier families could afford more candles, allowing conversations, reading, music, or sewing to continue after sunset. Ordinary workers often finished their day shortly after darkness, fell simply because continuing required precious candlelight. The arrival of night naturally encouraged rest in a world where artificial lighting remained limited. Even silence carried meaning inside the tower. During ordinary evenings, residents expected familiar background sounds, the crackling of fireplaces, distant conversations, footsteps crossing stone passages, horses shifting in their stalls, and guards calling to one another from the walls. When those sounds suddenly disappeared, people noticed immediately. Unusual quiet often suggested that something important was happening somewhere nearby. Experienced residents paid close attention to these subtle changes. Many people imagine medieval castles as gloomy places, but there were moments of remarkable beauty inside the tower. Early morning sunlight shining through stained glass scattered brilliant colours across stone floors. After rain, every wall reflected the evening light with surprising brightness. During winter, frost covered rooftops with sparkling crystals that glittered beneath the rising sun. In spring, flowering plants softened the hard edges of the fortress, reminding everyone that nature quietly reclaimed even the strongest human structures. Books remained valuable possessions. Most ordinary people owned none at all, while wealthy residents treasured carefully copied manuscripts decorated with colourful illustrations. Reading was often a shared activity. Someone able to read aloud might gather family members or servants to hear religious stories, poetry, or accounts of distant lands. Books represented knowledge, prestige, and enormous expense because every page had been copied entirely by hand. The tower also possessed countless hidden corners rarely seen by visitors. Narrow staircases disappeared into towers. Small storage rooms tucked beneath larger halls held supplies for emergencies. Tiny windows overlooked unexpected views of the river. Quiet courtyards offered moments of peace away from the busiest pathways. Long-time residents gradually discovered these secluded places, often seeking them whenever they wanted a few minutes away from the constant activity. Workshops produced a steady soundtrack throughout the day, the rhythmic tapping of chisels shaping stone, blended with the scraping of saws cutting timber. Hammers rang against glowing iron, while leather workers stitched belts, saddles, and scabbards. The smell of freshly cut wood mixed with hot metal and leather, creating an atmosphere that reminded everyone the fortress depended upon skilled craftsmen, just as much as it depended upon soldiers. The tower's kitchens revealed another fascinating reality of medieval life. Nothing was truly wasted. Bones became soup stock. Leftover bread thickened stews. Animal fat produced candles and cooking grease. Vegetable scraps fed pigs or chickens. Ash from fireplaces sometimes helped make soap. Every household understood that wasting resources increased hardship later. Careful management meant survival, particularly during difficult winters. Visitors often noticed the ravens before anything else. These intelligent birds seemed completely at home among the ancient walls. They watched workers from rooftops, hopped confidently across courtyards, searching for scraps, and occasionally startled newcomers by appearing unexpectedly beside them. Long before later, legends connected the ravens to the fate of the kingdom. They had already become familiar companions to generations of tower residents. Evening meals brought together people who had spent the day scattered across different duties. Families, servants, and fellow workers exchanged stories while eating bread, stews, roasted meats, vegetables, cheese, or fish, depending upon their household status. These conversations served an important purpose beyond simple companionship. Information spread naturally around the dinner table. News from London, rumours from the royal court, weather forecasts, upcoming festivals, and family concerns all became topics of discussion before everyone prepared for another day. For elderly residents, the tower represented a lifetime of memories. They remembered buildings before repairs altered them. They recalled former commanders, kings, queens, servants, and neighbours, long since gone. Younger generations often gathered eagerly to hear stories describing how the fortress had changed over decades. These memories connected everyday life with the long history unfolding around them. As midnight approached, the tower settled into its quietest hours. Fires burned lower, candles disappeared one by one, and nearly every doorway stood closed. Above the walls, the stars shone brilliantly over medieval London. The river continued its endless journey toward the sea, carrying boats that would arrive with tomorrow's supplies before dawn. Somewhere a lone guard adjusted his cloak against the cool night air and continued walking his familiar route, just as countless others had done before him. To live inside the Tower of London was to experience history, not as a series of dramatic events, but as an endless collection of ordinary moments. Most days passed without executions, royal ceremonies, or political conspiracies. Instead, they were filled with the smell of fresh bread, the sound of hammer strikes echoing through workshops, the warmth of shared meals, the satisfaction of honest work completed before sunset, and the quiet comfort of familiar routines repeated season after season. The tower's walls witnessed some of England's greatest triumphs and darkest tragedies, but for the people who called it home, it was also the place where children learned to walk, friendships lasted decades, families celebrated holidays, neighbours borrowed tools, and another ordinary sunrise always promised another ordinary day. Those simple human experiences, repeated thousands of times across nearly 1,000 years, formed the true life of the tower, far more than the famous stories that history would later choose to remember. Imagine arriving at the Tower of London for the very first time after travelling for days along muddy English roads. As you cross the final bridge toward the fortress, the massive stone walls seem to rise higher with every step. Soldiers watched from above, their helmets catching the afternoon sunlight, while colourful banners fluttered in the wind high atop the towers. The gates appeared enormous, built from thick oak reinforced with heavy bands of iron. As they slowly opened, the sounds of the bustling city outside faded behind you. Instead, you entered a completely different world. A place where every building, every courtyard, and every narrow passage served a purpose, and where life was governed by discipline, routine, and the constant awareness that you were standing at the very centre of royal power. The first thing that surprised many newcomers was just how crowded the tower could become. Modern visitors often imagine vast empty spaces between the buildings. But centuries ago, the courtyards were alive with activity from sunrise until long after sunset. Horses trotted between stables and storehouses. Servants hurried in every direction carrying baskets, buckets, and bundles of firewood. Officials discussed royal business while walking briskly across the yards. Craftsmen pushed handcarts loaded with timber, barrels, and tools. Children darted between adults, laughing until a parent called them back. The fortress felt less like an isolated castle and more like a thriving neighborhood surrounded by powerful defensive walls. No matter where you walked, your feet constantly reminded you that comfort was not a priority in medieval England. The ground beneath you changed from uneven cobblestones to rough-packed earth, and worn stone staircases polished smooth by countless generations. After hours of walking, even the strongest boots could not prevent tired legs. By the end of each day, servants and guards alike often welcomed the chance to sit beside a warm fire, remove their boots, and rest aching feet before beginning the same routine again the following morning. One of the most remarkable features of life inside the tower was how closely people lived alongside history without fully realizing it. Today, visitors stop to admire buildings because of the famous events that happened there centuries ago. But to those who actually lived within the walls, those buildings simply served practical purposes. A chamber where a future queen might one day be imprisoned was, at another time, simply another room requiring cleaning, repairs, and regular maintenance. A great hall remembered today for historic ceremonies might have hosted ordinary dinners on hundreds of quiet evenings. History only became history after it had already passed. The fortress also demanded extraordinary organization behind the scenes. Every loaf of bread, every barrel of ale, every piece of firewood, every candle, every sack of grain, every horseshoe, every nail, every length of rope, and every bolt of cloth had to be carefully counted and stored. Running such a large household required detailed planning. Supplies could not simply be replaced instantly if something ran out. Officials kept careful records because shortages could quickly become serious problems during periods of political unrest or poor weather. Despite the tower's reputation as a military fortress, laughter was a familiar sound. Children invented games using wooden hoops, carved toys, stones, and sticks. Servants teased one another while completing repetitive chores. Musicians entertained gatherings during holidays and celebrations. Storytellers filled long winter evenings with tales of brave knights, distant kingdoms, dragons, saints, and miracles. Even soldiers found reasons to joke during long hours of guard duty, understanding that humor helped make difficult work more bearable. The changing light throughout the day transformed the appearance of the tower in ways modern visitors rarely experience. At sunrise, long shadows stretched across empty courtyards, while dew sparkled on patches of grass. By midday, bright sunlight reflected from pale stone walls, making the fortress seem almost dazzling under clear skies. Evening softened every corner with golden light before darkness gradually swallowed the buildings one by one. Finally, torchlight replaced daylight, giving familiar pathways an entirely different appearance, filled with dancing shadows and glowing windows. Living inside the tower also meant becoming familiar with the moods of the River Thames. At high tide, the water reached almost to the fortress's riverside defences, bringing ships close enough for conversations between sailors and guards. At low tide, muddy banks emerged, exposing wooden posts, discarded objects, and flocks of birds searching for food. The smell of salt water mixed with fresh air during pleasant weather, while storms turned the river into a churning grey mass crashing against docks and boats tied along the shore. Meals reflected the changing rhythm of the year. Spring introduced fresh herbs and tender vegetables. Summer brought berries, cherries, and plentiful fish. Autumn filled tables with apples, pears, root vegetables, and game from nearby forests. Winter relied heavily on preserved foods prepared months earlier. Every season tasted different because refrigeration did not exist. People eagerly anticipated familiar foods returning each year, making seasonal change something they could literally taste. The tower's walls protected more than people. They sheltered knowledge, wealth, and symbols of royal authority. Important records were carefully stored because they documented land ownership, taxes, treaties, and royal decisions. Weapons remained locked safely inside armories, awaiting inspection or use. Valuable objects belonging to the crown were guarded with exceptional care. Those living inside the fortress understood that they were helping protect not only buildings, but also the institutions upon which the kingdom itself depended. Even ordinary weather created memorable experiences. On windy days, banners snapped loudly above the battlements, while cloaks billowed dramatically behind anyone crossing open courtyards. After heavy rain, reflections of towers shimmered in puddles scattered across worn stone paths. Bright moonlight transformed pale walls into silver shapes, rising silently above the sleeping city. During autumn mornings, fallen leaves collected in corners where servants patiently swept them away before beginning other duties. Visitors often assumed that everyone inside the tower constantly discussed politics, but everyday conversation usually focused on much simpler matters. People worried about family members, rising food prices, damaged clothing, sore muscles, upcoming religious festivals, troublesome weather, and whether enough supplies would arrive before winter. Grand political events certainly affected their lives, but ordinary concerns occupied far more of their daily thoughts. Zone rarely considered aspect of tower life was the constant need for cleaning fireplaces produced ash every day. Horses left manure throughout stable yards. Kitchens generated food scraps requiring disposal. Dust settled upon furniture, tapestries, and floors, despite every effort to keep rooms tidy. Servants swept, scrubbed, polished, washed, and repaired, almost endlessly without their work. The fortress would quickly have become uncomfortable, despite its impressive appearance. As years passed, residents marked time not by calendars alone, but by familiar recurring events. The first frost of winter, the blooming of herbs in spring gardens, the arrival of particular merchant ships, the annual repair of roofs after storm season, Christmas feasts, Easter services, harvest celebrations, and royal birthdays. These repeated moments created a comforting rhythm that helped people navigate lives often filled with uncertainty. The tower also encouraged observation. Guards noticed every unfamiliar face. Servants recognized changes in their employers' moods. Stable workers detected the slightest sign of illness in valuable horses. Gardeners observed the weather with careful attention because crops depended upon it. Living in such an important place sharpened people's awareness of small details that others might ignore. As evening settled over the fortress one final time, the great gates slowly closed, separating the tower from the bustling streets of London beyond. Inside the walls, fires flickered behind leaded windows, casting warm light onto ancient stone that had already witnessed centuries of human lives. Families gathered around simple suppers. Children listened sleepily to bedtime stories. Guards tightened their cloaks against the cool night air, and somewhere a clerk finished writing the last lines of an official document before blowing out his candle. Tomorrow would almost certainly begin just as today had, with bells, footsteps, smoke rising from chimneys, and another ordinary sunrise illuminating one of the most extraordinary places in England. That is perhaps the greatest surprise about living inside the Tower of London. History remembers it as a place of crowns, conspiracies, imprisonment, and power. Yet the people who actually called it home experienced something far more familiar. They measured their lives through shared meals, changing seasons, hard work, quiet friendships, children's laughter, evening prayers, and countless ordinary routines repeated day after day. The famous events that fill history books occupied only brief moments. Everything in between, the thousands of simple, peaceful, and deeply human days, was what truly made the tower a home for generation after generation of its residents. Imagine standing at one of the highest points of the tower, just as dawn painted the eastern sky in soft shades of pink and gold. From up there, the entire city of London seemed to awaken beneath you. Chimneys slowly released thin ribbons of smoke into the cool morning air. Church bells echoed from every direction, overlapping one another until the whole city seemed to hum with life. Merchants unlocked the shutters of their shops, fishermen guided their boats along the Thames, and the first wagons rattled across the streets, carrying goods toward busy marketplaces. Yet inside the tower, the morning unfolded with a calm precision that had been repeated for centuries. Every resident knew where they were expected to be, what work awaited them, and how the day would likely unfold, even though everyone understood that a single royal command could change everything before sunset. Living inside the tower meant becoming familiar with hundreds of tiny details that outsiders never noticed. Residents knew exactly which staircases became slippery after rain, which doors stuck during damp weather, and which fireplaces drew smoke properly even on windy days. They remembered where pigeons preferred to nest each spring, and which corners of the fortress received the warmest afternoon sunlight during winter. These practical observations became second nature after years spent within the walls, turning an intimidating fortress into a place that felt surprisingly familiar. The passage of time revealed itself everywhere. Stone steps slowly curved beneath the weight of countless generations. Climbing them, wooden door handles became smooth from thousands of hands. The edges of benches softened after decades of daily use. Even the great gates carried scars left by weather, repairs, and constant opening and closing. Residents often touched these worn surfaces without thinking, unknowingly placing their hands where kings, servants, soldiers, craftsmen, and children had done exactly the same thing for centuries before them. The tower also possessed an extraordinary variety of sounds depending on where you stood. Near the kitchens came the cheerful clatter of pots, chopping knives striking wooden boards, and the crackle of burning logs. The workshops echoed with hammer blows, sawing timber, and the rhythmic sharpening of blades. Stables were filled with horses, snorting softly, leather harnesses creaking, and stable hands speaking quietly to nervous animals. Near the walls overlooking the river, the sounds changed completely. Waves lapped gently against wooden docks while sailors shouted instructions across the water. Their voices carried surprisingly far by the breeze. For many residents, one of the greatest pleasures came from the changing views beyond the fortress walls. Looking north revealed the ever-growing city with its maze of narrow streets and crowded buildings. Looking south across the Thames offered views of open countryside gradually giving way to villages and fields. Every season transformed these landscapes. Spring covered nearby fields with fresh green growth. Summer filled the river with bustling traffic. Autumn painted distant trees with brilliant shades of amber and crimson. Winter often cloaked the entire landscape beneath frost or mist, making familiar landmarks appear almost mysterious. The tower's chapels remained among the quietest places within the fortress, while courtyards bustled with activity. Stepping inside these sacred spaces brought an immediate sense of calm. The cool stone walls muted outside noise, leaving only the soft echo of footsteps and whispered prayers. Sunlight filtered through coloured glass, painting the floor with brilliant patterns that shifted slowly throughout the day. Many residents sought these peaceful moments whenever life beyond the chapel doors became overwhelming. Daily chores often created unexpected opportunities for conversation. Drawing water from the well, preparing vegetables, mending clothing, or carrying firewood rarely required complete silence. Workers exchanged family news, discussed the weather, laughed at small mishaps, or quietly shared rumours circulating through London. These casual conversations strengthened friendships and built a sense of community that helped people endure the long hours of demanding work. Not every day inside the tower was pleasant. Illness occasionally spread despite everyone's efforts to maintain cleanliness. Heavy storms damaged roofs and flooded low-lying areas. Supplies sometimes arrived late after difficult weather made roads or rivers dangerous. Political tensions created uncertainty, especially when powerful nobles or royal officials arrived unexpectedly. Yet even during these difficult periods, ordinary routines continued. Fires still needed tending, bread still required baking, and guards still walked their familiar patrols. Children experienced the fortress in ways adults rarely could. Where grown-ups saw defensive walls, children saw places to invent adventures. A narrow staircase became the entrance to an imaginary kingdom. A quiet courtyard became the setting for games lasting entire afternoons. Every tower seemed filled with exciting possibilities. Growing up surrounded by soldiers, craftsmen, noble visitors, and royal ceremonies gave these children an unusual understanding of the wider world, even if they never travelled far beyond the tower itself. One remarkable aspect of life inside the tower was how deeply everyone depended upon one another. A cook relied on gardeners and merchants. Gardeners relied on blacksmiths to repair tools. Soldiers depended on armourers to maintain weapons. Clerks relied on messengers to deliver important documents. Stable workers trusted farriers to care for horses. Every role supported countless others, creating a community where cooperation mattered just as much as hierarchy. The changing seasons influenced clothing almost as much as fashion. During bitter winters, people wrapped themselves in layers of wool-lined cloaks, gloves, and fur whenever possible. Spring encouraged lighter garments as temperatures gradually rose. Summer brought relief from heavy clothing, though modesty still dictated long sleeves and carefully arranged garments. Autumn signalled the return of thicker fabrics as families prepared once again for colder months ahead. The tower's kitchens taught patience above all else. Nothing cooked quickly over open fires. Stews simmered for hours. Bread required careful rising before baking. Roasted meats turned slowly beside the flames under constant supervision. Even boiling water demanded time and firewood. Meals represented the combined effort of many people working together throughout the day, making shared dinners feel like the natural reward for everyone's labour. Even simple objects carried great value. A well-made wooden spoon might remain in use for years. Iron cooking pots lasted generations when carefully maintained blankets, tools, knives, and leather boots were repaired, repeatedly rather than replaced. People viewed possessions differently, because every object required significant time and skill to produce. Wastefulness was not simply discouraged. It was often impossible to afford. The arrival of important visitors always brought excitement. Courtyards filled with extra servants preparing rooms. Kitchens increased their activity to provide elaborate meals. Guards polished armour until it gleamed. Floors were swept, banners displayed, and furniture carefully arranged. Even those unlikely to meet distinguished guests directly enjoyed observing the preparations and guessing who might be arriving through the great gates. As evening approached, smoke drifting from dozens of chimneys merged into one great cloud above the fortress. The smell of supper spread through every corner of the tower. Families reunited after long hours apart. Children eagerly described the adventures of their day, while parents shared news gathered during their work. Outside, the city gradually settled beneath the fading light. But inside the tower, another cycle quietly continued. When darkness finally covered London, the stars shone brilliantly above the fortress walls. Without modern streetlights, the night sky appeared breathtakingly clear. Constellations guided travellers, sailors, and watchmen alike. The moon illuminated rooftops with pale silver light, casting long shadows across silent courtyards. From somewhere high on the battlements came the measured footsteps of another guard beginning his watch, a sound that had echoed through the tower for generations and would continue for centuries more. If you had spent your entire life within those walls, the tower would never have felt like the legendary landmark that later generations came to admire. It would simply have been the place where you celebrated birthdays, mourned lost friends, watched children grow into adults, planted gardens. Each spring prepared for winter every autumn, and greeted familiar neighbours every morning. Its towering walls would have represented security rather than spectacle. Its ancient stones would have held memories instead of mysteries. Long before tourists crossed its gates to explore England's history, the Tower of London was first and foremost a home, a place where thousands of ordinary lives quietly unfolded, one sunrise, one season, and one generation at a time, leaving behind an invisible history just as meaningful as the famous events remembered by the world today.